Palestine, of course, it's a vexing issue. It has been an issue within the South African struggle that has preoccupied our liberation movements, the ANC and the Pan-Africanist Congress, and has indeed, animated world history for quite a long time, since the 1940s, and perhaps even before that, as you would know, that in the first decades of the 1900s, there was the Balfour Declaration. In the late 1800s, you had the first World Zionist Congress, and so this eventually led to what we know as the annexation of Palestine today, of course, going through many stages, many evolutions, including United Nations resolution, which essentially carved up Palestine, and leaving, of course, Palestinians stateless as a consequence thereof. Now, yourself as a young, activist in the 1970s, really, can you perhaps give us a brief historical overview of your own awakening to the imperative of building solidarity amongst the press, and indeed your own awakening regarding the oppression of the Palestinian people?
Well, as a matter of fact, I left the country when I was 17 years. I joined the PAC, the Pan-Africanist Congress of Azania. Later on, I joined its military wing, the Azanian People's Liberation Army. And in the camps, we used to discuss a lot of revolutions raging on globally. And one revolution that really touched our hearts was the Palestinian struggle against Israeli settler colonialism. And of course, we were very, very close to the Palestinians, as a matter of fact, because some of our cadres trained in Lebanon by the Palestinian conflict. That happened in 1980. A group of 30 people, up like cadres, were trained by Palestinian convicts. And of course, they were there and they returned to Dar es Salaam the following year, 1981. Now, as a matter of fact, among other things in the camps, we used to have current affairs discussions, and the plight of Palestinians featured prominently. So actually, being a freedom fighter, it was a priority that we had to understand other struggles going on. And of course, with the Palestinians, it was just natural that we were going to identify with them. And a number of factors really influenced us to identify with them. One of the defining date in their calendar was 1948. And it was the same with us. It was a defining a year for us. As you know, that the Nationalist Party took over and introduced apartheid. So the Palestinian people lost 100% of their land. Well, we can say at the time they lost 55% of their land because a third of the population, which the Jews made a third of the population, were given 55% of the Palestinian land. So, yeah, I'm actually being taken away by this, but in a nutshell, the awakening in me was natural because we were in the same trenches with the Palestinian people.
Oh, that's absolutely very interesting. It's interesting, especially the parallel that you draw between our own experience in South Africa in 1948 with the National Party assuming power and beginning a thorough process of institutionalized apartheid as we came to know it in later years. While, and I'm careful to say institutionalized apartheid, because apartheid, there was indeed apartheid even during the colonial times, right? Though not institutionalized in the manner that the National Party did since 1948. But then at the same time, you had the establishment of the Jewish state of Israel. Together with that, it's also a very interesting historical, coincidence that these two regimes, pariahs as they were, came to be very close and collaborated on a number of issues, including military cooperation in the development of nuclear weapons, where South Africa, apartheid South Africa gave the Israelis uranium, which was quite common in South Africa, and mined here. And of course, the Israelis giving South Africa the technology to build these nuclear weapons. Another interesting coincidence is if you look at the suppression laws that were enacted in South Africa and mirrored, in fact, against Palestinians within the occupied Palestinian territories. I'm talking about the state of emergency here that was characterized by things like, detentions without trials, and assassinations, and so on, exactly the same. Now, there was a time in the 1970s, you would recall, when these two regimes were actually exchanging police security, officials. Some, Israeli soldiers coming into our townships with the South African Defense Force and the police, getting training in how to suppress us, and then going back to Israel and implementing those same, tactics against the Palestinian, the Palestinians within Palestine itself. Doesn't it strike you that the fact that today Israel is an apartheid state, in many ways similar, not identical, but in many ways similar to the South African apartheid, doesn't it strike you as a logical consequence of settler colonialism?
The collaboration between the apartheid South Africa and the apartheid Israel is well documented. Incidentally, when applicators were training in Lebanon, the Israel, through their intelligence networks, got the information that there were freedom fighters from South Africa training in Lebanon, in southern Lebanon. And actually, they made it their mission that they should be captured alive and be tried in Pretoria. Fortunately, out of 30, not a single one was captured alive. They all returned safely to the base in Dar es Salaam, Tanzania. So it shows you the level of collaboration between the two settler colonialist regimes. However, likening Israel to apartheid South Africa, I think the level of and the intensity of evil is greater in Israel than in apartheid South Africa. And most people really don't notice that. Apartheid, with all its evil deeds, with all its separation of people based on the pigmentation of one's color, they did build a wall between the race groups, but they never built the physical wall, as is the case in Israel. And apartheid, with all its weaknesses and evil deeds, did create some, Bantustans. But now those Bantustans, if you look at them, you find that they had some competencies to an extent that some of them, Bantustan leaders, ended up among the ranks of the liberation movement. People like General Bandu Bonge Olomisa. And actually he contributed using the same Bantustan system to undermine the larger scheme of apartheid. Now, you go to occupied Palestinian territories. I mean, what's happening in East Jerusalem? What's happening in West Bank? What's happening in Gaza? whereby even the infrastructure, even the power, I mean, the source of electricity, the power points are being destroyed. To this day, in Israel, we have imprisonment without charge and without trial. Now, I don't remember in apartheid South Africa, yeah, it used to be 90 days and later on it was changed. So I think in terms of the level of intensity of evil, by far, Israel surpasses apartheid South Africa. And again, make another comparison. The two regimes were fueled by the myths. In South Africa, they call them Heeren folk, which means God-chosen people. And in Israel, it's the same thing. They call themselves God-chosen people, which is a myth. And another myth is the myth of the promised land. That's not the promised land, it's the conquered land. Because if it was the promised land, why did it have to take over 2,000 years? It was not even conceptualized, as you correctly pointed out, until 1896, when the political Zionists organized themselves. And of course, Zionism has always been there, but it was an article of faith. But this time it became politicized by people like Theodore Herz, and of course they had to go to Palestine, which was 100% the land of the Palestinian people. So indeed, comparing South Africa to Israel is being unfair to South Africa, even if we know that the twin evils, collaborated. But in terms of intensity of evil, Israel by far surpasses apartheid South Africa.
No, it's a very, very interesting, perspective that you are giving us there. A little, perhaps just in passing, but a little known fact is the collaboration of organizations like the South African Zionist Federation and the South African Jewish Board of Deputies in bolstering apartheid South Africa and Israel's collaboration. And indeed, even alienating those Jewish comrades who came from that community, who joined the struggle of the oppressed in South Africa, alienating them, isolating them away from that community. These organizations their role has been insidious, and has historically been very anti-African. It's been very the anti-colonial struggles, and has been staunchly pro-apartheid. And so it comes as no surprise, therefore, that they still support apartheid Israel to this day. Any brief thought about that?
Well, a little known fact is that the South African Jewish community, in terms of Jewish diaspora contribution towards the state of Israel, rated #1, and they're still rated #1. They even contribute by far more than American Jewish community. Now, it tells you the amount of wealth from this country that is being used to prop apartheid Israel. And yes, we know that even young Jewish men, perhaps even women, used to be recruited into the Israeli Defense Force from South Africa. So yes, indeed, the struggle is not per se against the Jews, because Jews we have got progressive Jews like Ron Kasrils and many others who are being isolated, as you correctly pointed out. But of course, the problem is Zionist movement, which actually has caused a lot of problem in that part of the world. But again, the big powers, the big Western powers, are complicit of the crime of occupation. in Palestine. They are complicit of the crime of settler colonialism in Palestine. Because if you look at Balfour Declaration, where was it cooked? It was cooked in the British Parliament, whereby the Foreign Secretary Arthur Balfour came with that declaration. And even if they knew that at the end of their mandate, the land had to be returned to the rightful owners, the Palestinian people, but they gave it away to the Jewish settlers, who were just a minority. And as a result, and another very, very striking comparison, I mean, apartheid in South Africa was very brutal, was very ruthless. I don't even want to be a spokesperson, but they never made it a program that they were going to drive us out of the country. But in 1948, nearly 1 million Palestinians had to be driven out of their land of birth. Over 400 villages were razed to the ground. And as I'm speaking right now, over 7 million Palestinians are in exile. And even if the international community had declared that they must return, Israel is defying that. And actually, Israel is a terrorist state because it has been terrorizing people from their homes. In one of the Intifada, they demolished 25% of the buildings in Gaza. They killed over 2,000 people, including 300 children. Is that not an act of terrorism? It's a pure act of terrorism. And of course, the reason why we're still in majority indigenous African people in this country is because the apartheid South Africa never drove us out of this land so that they can numerically overtake us. And this is what the Jews, the state of Israel is doing in the occupied Palestine.
No, it's I'm happy that you clarified, the question of Jews vis-a-vis the apartheid state of Israel, because as you would know, we are often accused of being anti-Semitic for merely declaring political Zionism for what it is, a vile political ideology. That seeks to perpetuate racial and ethnic supremacy. It is an ideology that at its core is no different from the ideology that was driven by white Afrikaner nationalists. But its consequences, as you correctly point out, are worse, in Palestine. And I've had the honor and privilege to visit Gaza a few years ago. And for those of our comrades who haven't had that opportunity, it is a heartbreak story. There is not a single building, right from Rafah at the border, or at least Khan Yunis, one of the close areas close to the Rafah crossing, right up to Gaza City, has not been affected, doesn't carry a scar of battle. There's not a building that doesn't have, damage to it. From Khan Yunis to the refugee camps around Gaza City. It's a heartbreak story. And I wish more people could really see what is happening in Gaza, and of course in the other Palestinian occupied territories. I want to bring you a little bit to more contemporary issues, and perhaps lay this sort of groundwork by saying, look, it's been 72 years, since the establishment of the State of Israel, and what all impartial scholars, objective scholars at least, recognize is a program of ethnic cleansing, as you correctly pointed out as well, of the Palestinians. Now, the Palestinian struggle has gone through evolution. Since the literal takeover of Palestinian lands, even before 1947, just right at the eve of the departure of the British. That period, that interregnum, if you wish, when this gang started, committing this genocide in Palestine, that led to so many Palestinians fleeing. This struggle has gone through evolution. It started with armed resistance against these genocidal Jewish gangs. It then, became a full-blown Arab-Israeli war. There were other conflicts and conflagrations in the following decades. The Palestinian struggle, took on a character of armed struggle. This later was followed by negotiations. In between, you had the first and second intifadas. We are now at a point where we are talking about what we call divestment and sanctions. So what do you think? And perhaps I should throw into the mix, you have an international system that has dismally failed to address a problem they created in the first place. Remember, as you correctly pointed out, the UN decided to partition Palestine without consulting with indigenous populations. That was the genesis, really, of the problem in the international system and international law. All these institutions are essentially impotent in addressing this issue. Negotiations are collapsed. Israel and the US, on the other hand, are ensuring that the changes that they are making on the ground become irreversible. They are putting new facts on the ground, making the creation of a Palestinian state virtually impossible. The Europeans are standing on the sideline, partly complicit, partly paying lip service to Palestinian liberation. You have a Trump administration that now is blatantly, pushing countries at gunpoint towards a consensus, starting with moving embassies to Jerusalem, and so you have these factors that are playing into the entire situation. What do you think at this point will alter the balance of forces in favor of the Palestinian struggle?
Yeah, before I answer your question, I just want to chip in a few points. First, on anti-Semitism, I think it's one of the scarecrow that the state of Israel and its apologists flag, when they actually hide their evil intentions. Because supporting the right of the Palestinian people to a homeland, to an independent state, is not equivalent to hating anyone. And they know that. It's the same thing that happened in South Africa. Anyone who was fighting for the return of the land, for justice, for equality of citizens, was called a communist. Some of them had not even read Das Kapital. They don't even know what communism is, but they were just lumped together as communists. Now, so Israelis have found a way of escaping from a critique and criticism by labeling anyone who is saying, let there be peace and justice in the land of Palestine, to be anti-Semitism. But even that, if you look who is a Semite, Palestinians are Semite. So we cannot be anti. The Jews have monopolized Semitism as if only themselves are Semites. No, that's not true. Palestinians are equally Semite. So that's one thing. Another thing, which I just want to chip in, actually, as liberation movement, we have suffered at the hands of Israeli-American conspiracy. There was a school in Tanzania, in Morogoro. I think it was Morogoro Multi Liberation College. But cadres of APLA and MK used to do their medical training there. But as a way of punishment, the US withdrew funding because from UNESCO, because it was a UNESCO school. And once they withdrew that funding, cadres, especially cadres of PAC, because by that time I think the ANC had withdrawn their cadres, had to suffer due to budgetary constraints. And the target there was the Palestinians, because the Americans were complaining that UNESCO was supporting the Palestinian cause. As a matter of fact, UNESCO is the only UN organization that has recognized or given Palestine full state status. Now, I just wanted to point out that. But now, coming to the struggle, I don't want to be prescriptive to the people of Palestine on how to struggle. But if you look at the balance of forces in terms of militarization of the struggle, it has proven that each time, Palestinians, launch one rocket which lands in one of the settlement areas there and kills one person, you must be sure that thousands of Palestinians are going to die in retaliation. Many buildings are going to be demolished in retaliation. Children are going to be killed in retaliation. So that really puts into picture, should Palestinians live to fight another day, or should they commit national suicide? So this is another way that I think is up to Palestinians to see other constructive and fruitful ways of fighting, because in terms of military balance of forces, I think Israel is not only by far too powerful to the Palestinian people. I mean, all combined Arab, military strength cannot stand a chance against Israel. 1967, well, it showed us. And here is not Israel that is fighting. Basically, it's America, because all the equipment, all their modern weapons, they get it from Washington and from the West. And it is Israel is flouting every international convention you can think of, every international resolution you can think of, but it's not being punished. And Iran, for building nuclear facility on its own land, is being punished. But Israel is immune or immunized by the West, from any form of punishment. Now, again, another very, very serious weakness on the international community approach to resolving the Palestine-Israel conflict. Everything has been put in the hands of Washington. So the US is running the show in terms of seeking a peaceful settlement in that part of the world. And in 1993, the US brokered talks led to Oslo peace accords, which most of the Palestinians were happy that it was going to bring something, because in those accords it was agreed upon that within 5 years of the signing of Oslo Accords, Palestine was going to have its own state. It was going to be recognized as a state, an independent state. And here we must bear in mind an independent state on 12% of the land that was originally the land of the Palestinians. Now, that was a huge compromise, but it was something because it was better than nothing. But even that compromise did not live to see the light of the day because no one is talking about Oslo peace accords today. Actually, is as good as dead. However, I sometimes even feel guilty myself that one is not doing enough to support the cause of the Palestinians. I think they deserve sacrifices from all of us. I think we need to see economic sanctions being implemented just to boost their morale. But whatever form of struggle that the Palestinians are comfortable with, we must support at least that they should have a land that they call theirs. And all refugees, 7 million, must be
that's a
temporary.
good segue into as we are going into the last few minutes of our conversation into Africa. Let's speak a little bit about Africa. Now, perhaps let me just point out a few facts. Israel, for the past few years, at least since 2015, in particular, when they really now started to address it, but they have been trying to do this for quite some time. We have seen, Israel, number one, since their first priority on the African continent is to gain observer status in the African Union. They failed a few attempts, many few attempts have failed, of course being blocked by countries like South Africa and others to gain observer status, which is enjoyed by the Palestinians. Now, having failed, what they then did is they approached countries like Nigeria, Uganda, Kenya, DRC, and so on. Those influential countries in East and West Africa. To use them as a thoroughfare, or as the tip of the spear in terms of their entry into the African continent. This then culminated in 2017 into Israel being a guest, or Netanyahu being a guest of ECOWAS, the Economic Community of West African States, in June. This was then quickly followed up by a so-called Israel-Africa Summit that was supposed to be held, I think it was in September of that year, 2007. Of course, that failed too, because South Africa and Namibia and other countries, especially those countries where you still have some form of liberation movement still in power, in the post-colonial period, who pushed against it. Of course, Kenya is another linchpin of Israeli entry into the continent. Of course, it was a meeting that was supposed to have been hosted by Togo, Nyasimbe, who was very enthusiastic for some reason, but then, of course, that failed. You then now have the latest, I'm jumping, all the other developments, but then in the latest developments, you have Kenya a few months ago, being pressured by the Trump administration into signing, diplomatic or normalizing, Israel-Kenyan relations, amongst others, demanding that Israel must be given preferential trade tariffs in the Kenyan markets. In exchange, Kenya would then be given preferential trade status in its trade with the United States. On the other hand, 2 weeks ago, we saw Sudan that was also pressured by the US government to normalize their relations with Israel at the point of a gun. Of course, they now have to pay 335 million for the embassy bombings in the 1990s, 1998. And over and above, they have to normalize these relations with Israel. So you have this following on the heels of these brutal Arab dictatorships in the Middle East, who themselves also have normalized relations with Israel, Bahrain, and the UAE. It seems that the Saudis are behind this thing, but I don't want us to focus on the Middle East at the moment. Let's focus on Africa. Now, the question then becomes twofold. One, seeing that, there are these developments, you must have seen that, I think it was at the end of last year, when the newly elected president of the DRC, Etienne Tshisekedi, went to address the APEC meeting in Washington, the African-Israeli, the Israeli lobby in America, but the acronym is APEC. So you see there's this two narrative, that some African countries are making towards Israel. So the question is, one, can Palestine still rely on African support, for its struggle? That's one, given these developments. But also two, what is to be done to bolster African unity around the anti-colonial struggle? Of course, taking into account that on the continent we still have Western Sahara that is still a colony on the African continent. But then, how do you build African unity? So those would be my I think, the last question.
Well, sometimes we overrate Africa because I think as Africans, we lack power. And whatever we give to the Palestinian in the form of support is definitely going to be symbolic. Well, symbolic support is better than no support. Because if you look at the Quislings, those countries that are normalizing ties with Israel, you'll find that they're doing that because they are hungry. And of course, when they go to the master in Washington, the master say, I'm going to give you a loaf of bread, but you could get 100 loaves of bread if you can recognize Israel. And actually, these people do get some material benefits for themselves, not for the citizens of their countries, by normalizing ties with Israel. Sudan, for instance, and of course, it is even laughable that Washington would list Sudan as a terrorist country, but once they normalize ties with Israel, then it's going to be removed from the terrorist list. So that's the problem with us Africans. And before the end of this interview, I think South African government deserves, some compliment that in spite of all the weaknesses and even some shortcomings, but the government has stood steadfastly behind the just struggle of the Palestinian people. And of course, that is highly, highly commendable, especially if we take into account that South Africa has the largest number of Jews, I think, in the whole African continent. But still, they come up with a progressive policy towards Palestine. Now, what is to be done, to support the Palestinian cause? As we're being betrayed by governments, I think the grassroots support is very, very vital. Because even in South Africa, governments do change. I don't think if one of the opposition takes over, especially the pro-Israeli opposition, the status quo is going to remain. But if on the ground, the people, NGOs like the one that you are involved in, Africa for Palestine, are strengthened, so that whoever is in government the Palestinians should enjoy the support from the grassroots, from the people. So, yes, indeed, I was disturbed recently when I learned that even our comrades in Zimbabwe are tilting towards Israel because apparently Washington told them that in order to have your diamonds sold, you must reach some, rapprochement with the state of Israel. So it is very, very unfortunate, really, that people that we thought that they understood thoroughly the plight of the Palestinian are actually going to normalize ties with Israel. But I am optimistic that no matter how long it takes, Palestine shall be free.
No, indeed, Palestine shall be free. It is perhaps part of the reasons why, comrade, we have decided as an organization, to expand, in fact, to make the African continent our focus. Because from our point of view, there is nothing more important, than creating grassroots support for the Palestinian struggle, so that Africans who understand and can literally feel the moral imperatives, of the Palestinian struggle can come together and exert the necessary pressure on their own governments, and wherever they find themselves. Because it's true what Martin Luther King said, that the moral arc of the universe is always bent towards justice. But it is a justice that we will fight for. And from that perspective, the unity of the African people on such a poignant moral issue of our time is absolutely crucial. Especially because we are the people who have themselves experienced colonialism and its worst, especially its worst excesses. We have seen that, we've been through that, and it behoves us in many ways, to become the torch bearers, and shine the light on its excesses. And Israel and its murderous policies in Palestine and the ethnic cleansing is certainly something that Africans should care about. And from our perspective, it is something that Africans, and I'm talking about the ordinary Africans here, not the ruling elites, would ordinarily care about, very much so, if they are adequately informed and they are adequately exposed to the realities of the Palestinian people. Comrade Klapa, thank you very much for your participation and sharing your thoughts with us. And we hope to have much more engagement with you in the future, and all of the best with your work forward.
Thanks so much. Goodbye.
Goodbye.
It's a new beginning. It's a new era.